Welcome to this screencast on Caribbean architecture. We're going to be looking at the vernacular, the colonial, and the modern, and how these styles or periods are reflected in the architecture in Trinidad. I'm hoping at the end of the screencast that you will be able to recognize key architectural phases typical of Caribbean architecture, appreciate the distinction and characteristics of vernacular, colonial, and modern architectural typologies, and appreciate the plurality and multiplicity of the varied forms of Caribbean architecture. Let's start with the traditional or vernacular. On this slide, you'll see a traditional Indian dwelling in central Trinidad, and this was made of natural materials, available materials locally. And the lower image, you will see a reproduction of an Amerindian dwelling, a longhouse that currently is at Cleaver Woods near Arima that you can go and visit. And it'll give you a very good idea of the form, the nature and the materials that characterize traditional or vernacular type structures before, in the case of the Cleaver Woods structure, before Trinidad was colonized. On the right-hand side, there are two images of vernacular type dwellings. On the left here, you can see a vernacular dwelling from Puerto Rico, and on the right, a vernacular dwelling from Trinidad. And these were drawings prepared by the Guadalupan architect Jacques Berthelot, who traveled around the Caribbean and who studied simple vernacular type architecture, dwelling houses, and he prepared a kind of taxonomy of forms, of different vernacular forms in his book Caribbean Architecture. And these two examples from Puerto Rico and Trinidad are taken from that book. And they show examples from a slightly later period than the ones on the left, probably the middle of the 19th or the late 19th century. These are two very useful texts for learning more about traditional or vernacular architecture. A Jupa by the Trinidadian architect John Newell Lewis is a very interesting account, narrative, historical account of the evolution of the simple Ajupa or Amerindian type dwelling right up to the present day, or the time the book was published up to 1984. And on the right, Kazantier, Jamun Karate, publication by Jacques Berthelot, who produced the archetypes in the previous slide, a Guadalupan architect. And this is a very fascinating book that delves into the materiality, the form, and the tectonics, what architects call the tectonics, the form and the structure of vernacular building types. Now let's move on to the colonial. We know that Trinidad was a colony for a period, like many other Caribbean islands. And at this time, the form of the city, the grid that we see today in the city of Port of Spain, the architecture, the form of the landscape, and the way that the city was inhabited all reflected colonial influence, with buildings, religious buildings and political buildings, government buildings having a dominance in the city and dominating in the grid, and then the form and the structure of the other buildings reflecting the styles and influences from Great Britain, and in many cases in Trinidad also influences from France, from Sicily, from different places, from Corsica, from all different parts of the world where tradesmen and skilled people came to participate in the development of the city. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about the nature of those styles and how to distinguish between those styles, in John Newell Lewis's book Ajupa, he has a number of very engaging drawings and sketches that explain the narrative, that explain the historical stylistic development of the architectural elements and features that characterized and still characterize the historical architecture of Port of Spain. We can see here a map of Port of Spain on the left-hand side in the middle of the 19th century, and then the top, an image of the railway station, which is down near the waterfront by South Quay, and that's very representative of the colonial style of architecture, made of masonry, what we call stereotomic form, heavy masonry form, creating a kind of dominance or emphasis of the architecture within the structure of the city that would have been predominantly timber structure at that time. And the image below this, an image of Frederick Street in the early part of the 20th century, where we can see the wrought iron systems-built structures that were imported from Europe in the 19th century that formed many of the large warehouse and retail spaces that characterize downtown Port of Spain, north of Independence Square and south of Park Street. These were all very typical of that period and reflective of the colonial influence in architecture. Active at that time in the 19th century was a painter named Michel Jean Casabon, and he painted landscapes, he painted people, but he also seemed to be very interested in the architectural and urban development of Port of Spain. And in this picture, which is a view from Laventille Hill looking west, we can see the reclamation taking place to create the part of the city now known as South Quay. And if you look near the horizon, there's a little pale green area almost on the horizon. That's Marine Square, the cluster of buildings to the left, the buildings that now exist between South Quay and Independence Square. And then to the left of that, as I said, South Quay whilst it was being reclaimed. And if you look carefully near the clusters of ships, you'll see the lighthouse that currently sits at the bottom of Frederick Street and Broadway on Wrightson Road, where Wrightson Road meets the highway, for those of you that are familiar with the Port of Spain. Very useful reference for understanding the development of the city over time. Michel Jean Casabon. There are a number of publications available by Michel Jean Casabon, and you also, if you Google Michel Jean Casabon's name, you'll see a range and a series of images that all depict images of colonial Trinidad. Now we come to the modern, the most recent period in architecture, and we can really say that the modern period in Trinidad started in the 50s. And this image may be familiar to anybody that is familiar with Port of Spain. It's Queen's Hall, and this depiction, this rendering, is actually the competition entry that Colin Laird submitted in the mid-50s for the building. And at that time, this would have represented an extremely avant-garde and very radical form. There would have been no buildings like this in Trinidad at the time, or in the Caribbean for that time, for example. It also represented part of a universal language of architecture. This was a type of architecture that was being built all over the world, and it represented, for the cultures and societies that were engaged with using this formal modern language, an opportunity to declare their presence in the modern world, to no longer be colonial satellites or peripheral places, but to declare their universality. This competition entry shows Queen's Hall on the competition site in what is now called Nelson Mandela Park. At the time was George V Park, but the building was actually built in St Anne's, adjacent to the Queen's Park Savannah. Some more examples of modern architecture in the top left here. We can see the Hilton Hotel, built in the 60s by the architect Torre Ferrer from Puerto Rico. Very distinguished building, again, very modern building. And we can see here the development of the city of Port of Spain, the development in the top right of Frederick Street, with the cars and the traffic and the modernization and the street lights, the electrification. And then in the 70s, the Eric Williams Financial Complex, some towers unprecedented in the country at the time, all examples of modernity. And then more recently, another type of modernism or modernity appearing in the form of luxury hotels. And here we show the Magdalena Grand in Tobago. All examples of a modern tendency or a modern trend. So that's an overview of a glimpse at the different types or periods, lenses in a way through which we might understand the formation and the formulation of architecture over time. And if you'd like to read a little more around this, there's an essay that I wrote in Small Axe, issue number 41, that talks about the history and nature of Caribbean architecture and talks about these different periods in greater depth. Jacques Berthelot's book Caribbean Style is a wonderful, colourful reference which contains the archetypes that appeared earlier in this presentation for many islands, which is an interesting reference. And then, of course, his book Casa Antilleja Muncarete, which is a more technical book, but an interesting book to look at for anyone interested. And then, of course, John Newell Lewis's text ajupa that we featured earlier. So that's the end of our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy your readings and your further research and exploration. Thank you.